back, everybody. Hi, Commissioner. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, so glad to be with you. Good to be with you. Good to see Chip again. Great to see most of the rest of you as well. It's a pretty good crowd. So yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, the 5G Commissioner puts on the hard hats, climbs up the towers, went to Catholic law. We have that in common. I will tell you, I will never climb a tower. We will never have that in common. But really, you've been such a great leader on broadband deployment issues, and just really want to thank you for your leadership and always coming to the policy summit to talk to us about what's going on at the FCC and on the Hill. And I know you said, well, we're going to spend like 45 minutes chatting.
Whatever you want, happy to do it. Yeah, no, it's great to be here. And to your point, yeah, as soon as I got in this job, I thought like the best way to do this job in DC is to spend as little time inside the Beltway as possible. So like, I think within a day of first being sworn into the job, got on a plane, went to North Carolina, went to a fiber manufacturing facility, and I spent a lot of time with, the fiber builders, the tower climbers, and I think there's no better way to sort of understand, the red tape that needs to be cut and the reforms that need to take place than, not that I don't like all the lawyers and lobbyists that are here, but when you cut out the layers of lawyers and lobbyists and talk right to the people that are actually building this stuff, and you ask them, what's jamming you up, what's slowing you down, and you'd be surprised, or maybe not, about the types of ideas that you hear out there on the road. So it's been a lot of fun.
That's great. It's a great place to start too, because we do have many fiber, fixed wireless, small cell companies in the room that are in the field deploying every day. Those who are looking at the BEAD program, right? So let's talk about what else the FCC could be doing along with the other agencies to improve the availability of broadband everywhere as we're using both public and private sector dollars to build.
Yeah, the playbook, when you look at trying to bridge the digital divide, get more Americans connected, increase competition, there's a lot you can do, but in the broadest brushstrokes, it's a two-part playbook, which is more spectrum and more infrastructure reform. And on some of those, I'm a little concerned about where we are generally. I think there's some warning signs about us sort of losing speed and momentum, particularly on spectrum matters. I think we've done a pretty good job, particularly the last couple of years, on freeing up what we call unlicensed spectrum. But when it comes to making sort of high power licensed spectrum available, obviously it's a difficult task right now to get that done. But I think we're sort of starting to fall behind other countries in availability of mid-band spectrum, which is concerning to me. Again, it's not easy. In many ways, this is spectrum that is owned or occupied by federal government users, including the Department of Defense. Since they have aircraft carriers, I'm usually loath to criticize them. But as a general matter, the federal government is not always the most efficient user of spectrum. So I do think we have to continue to be creative in how we free up more spectrum. So I'm a little concerned about where we are there. Infrastructure, obviously, there's always a lot more I think we can do on permitting reform that we should do. And stepping back to your point about BEAD, we have this sort of generational opportunity to truly end the digital divide with this $40+ billion initiative that is largely being administered out of Commerce. I don't feel bad about it that the FCC got pushed to the side.
Not jealous, just a little bit?
No, it's fine. No concerns at all. But obviously, I do wish BEAD all the success because we want to see Americans connected. But again, I think we're starting to see some warning signs there, in part because I think the administration has inserted some policy cuts along the way that I think are sort of sidetracking us from the ultimate goal of connectivity. So for one, I think there's some pressure towards rate regulation and some of the regulations implementing BEAD. Two, I think that there's been a very heavy thumb on the scale by the administration for fiber, which fiber is a fantastic technology. I spent a lot of time in the field, splicing fiber, and we want plenty of the lion's share of connections in the country to be fiber, but we need to leave room around the edges for, as you pointed out, fixed wireless and other sort of new technologies that are coming online, both because they can get the job done more efficiently from a dollars perspective, but two, they can get it done much more quickly in terms of the time that it takes to connect people. And in fact, again, we're starting to see some concerning signals, including we have up to 12 states now, by my count. They've either said or indicated that they are or may be unable to connect every location, at least from an underserved and unserved perspective, with the BEAD dollars that they've been allocated. So again, stepping back, if we were to take this $40+ billion initiative and through policy cuts land in a spot where it didn't get the job done, I think that'd be a big failure. But again, there is time to course correct. I think states are still working through the process. I would just encourage states to be an eye towards the efficient use of those dollars, because it's not clear we have another opportunity like BEAD possibly ever when you look at just the pace of technology change. So I think there is some course correction I would do there.
And then in terms of what you view as the FCC's role, not directly in BEAD, but maybe indirectly, ways that you can turn the dials that will help speed deployment, also help stretch those dollars further to kind of address this issue that you've raised.
Yeah, there's a lot more we can do on the permitting side. So there's two main provisions in the Communications Act, Section 253 and 332. And previously we'd issued guidance on how those regulations should be interpreted. Sometimes people looked at that as sort of as having to do exclusively with small cell technology. But I think there's more the FCC can do to come back and provide clarity as to how that existing federal law applies when carriers are looking to obtain permits and authorizations to build out. So I do think there's more in the infrastructure docket that the FCC could do that would help accelerate builds. Because again, at the end of the day, if we're just spending money to stimulate broadband build out, but we're not reforming the permitting laws, we're just stepping on the gas and the brakes at the same time. And I've seen, frankly, too many instances already. I was in Wyoming, for instance, visiting a broadband builder, and they took me to their laydown yard, which is sort of their outdoor warehouse where they keep their rolls of conduit and antennas, and they were just sitting there. And so we've gone through the process of getting the funding for that, of acquiring it, getting it to that location, but it can't get out into the field because permitting delays still exist. So there's more we need to do on that front as well.
And one of the things that INCOMPAS developed was a broadband ready city checklist just to help cities get prepared for the BEAD funding. And we've seen some states, move forward in adopting similar things and have included some of the language that we offered them. Really wanted to provide kind of a common template for states and cities to follow. We've seen states like Kansas, and Jade's in the room. She's heads of the Kansas broadband office, adopt these ready city checklists so that cities know what's coming, towns know what's coming, and they're like ready. When the boots hit the ground, the folks show up with the hard hats on, right? And so we can deliver more broadband quickly. So one of the things the commission recently did in December was address some of the poll issues that have been pending for a really long time, right? So give us your perspective on that action and how you see that fitting into the story here.
Yeah, I thought I'd lived through a lot of tough political debates in DC. I've lived through the Title II net neutrality proceeding, through multiple iterations. I've gone through digital discrimination, but I'd never seen a fight in DC quite like the pole attachment fight that we had at the FCC. I mean, you put, $2 or $3 on the line here or there, and all of a sudden it's a big deal to DC offices. So that was an interesting fight. We obviously teed up some additional ideas potentially that we could do. I don't have any ideas on timing that the FCC could do there, but as a general matter, obviously what we're trying to do is, again, make it easier, faster, more cost-effective for broadband builders to push out, to edge out, particularly into rural and unserved areas. And I think, again, stepping back, I think we're at an interesting point in time for Americans when it comes to connectivity, because we are truly living in what we sort of have called for years, this idea of convergence, but we're living it in a new way. So convergence obviously means that you can now effectively substitute, whether it's sort of a 5G high-speed mobile connection that can be, hundreds of megabits per second, to fixed wireless connection, to this new generation of low Earth orbit satellites that's providing very high-speed broadband. And then newly, and something we're going to vote on at the FCC, services that go direct from satellites right to your smartphone. So we're seeing all of this convergence where consumers can substitute, in many ways, one type of broadband technology for another that we've been looking to realize for a long time, but we're living it now. And so I think that needs to help inform our policymaking at the FCC, because we are historically a very siloed operation where it's, cable is regulated this way, mobile wireless is regulated this way. It's a challenge to break out of that, but ultimately we have to sort of see how those silos as a real matter have broken down, and how do we make sure we have level playing field? And that includes with pole attachments, so that everybody gets a fair shot at attaching.
Yeah, so it's most conferences that I attend, right? No one ever wants to talk about pole attachments, but this conference is a little different because these folks are living it every single day and trying to figure it out. And I think what has surprised me in my career, but probably should not have surprised me, was that I worked on pole attachment reform when I was working for Commissioner Clyburn back in the 2010, 2011 timeframe. And folks were like, if you just make sure that the rates between cable and telco attachments, even though you have to use different formulas, but they're about the same,
land in the same place.
Right. That's going to solve the problem. And I was like, that sounds like a really good idea. Okay, great. Let's solve that problem. And the problem is just shift to other things, right? So it's there's never this want of work, but yet it's so important right now because we have this significant investment that's being made by both the private and the public sectors. And this need to get the job done like once and be done, especially to the extent that so much of this coverage needs, fiber connectivity, right? We appreciate all the hard work on it.
Yeah.
I was recently reading the Washington Post and an opinion piece, and not by an opinion writer who ever writes on technology or broadband. And so I was a little surprised. This is a gentleman who just recently moved to more ex-urban Washington, so Rappahannock County, and he was describing how now through funding that the federal government has provided, I think it was even capital project funding, Rappahannock County is getting broadband. They're stringing fiber. And in the middle of the story, it was, but there's a dispute right now between the utility and the fiber provider on pole replacements. I mean, these disputes are ongoing all of the time, right? And the people on the ground are the ones that are having to look at the FCC rules. And then there's fights over who has to do what and what the timing is. So it matters. It matters what you're saying, what the agency says in an order and in the rules to encourage the deployment. So thanks for all your hard work. And I know there's probably a lot more we could say about polls, but we will move on.
I very much look forward to it.
But only us, right? And the people in this room. So the U.S. and its global leadership in wireless and fixed wireless. So right now, we have a significant problem in that the FCC doesn't have its spectrum auction authority, right? Yeah. However, the FCC's, you still have some tools in your toolkit that you can use to advance the availability of spectrum. Give us your perspective on the work that you're doing at the FCC right now, and in particular in the mid-band spectrum, how you view the importance of the FCC's work to deliver more spectrum availability to those who are going to use it to deliver broadband.
Yeah, as you noted, our Spectrum Auction Authority, which is not our only, but one of the main mechanisms we use to move spectrum out in the commercial marketplace, has lapsed for the first time, I guess, 20 years. Never happened before. And so that is sort of a one weight slowing us down. But to your point, there's still more the FCC could do. So for instance, a couple years ago, I put out a spectrum calendar that identified which spectrum bands we should move by which particular year. And even though we don't have auction authority, I think the FCC could still step up with its own spectrum calendar that made clear to lawmakers, say, if we had auction authority again, here's what we would move in this year, and this year, and this year. I think that would help provide some additional motivation for Congress, because when we aren't telling Congress very clearly what we would do if we have authority, then potentially they receive the message that it's not that serious. And it is. Again, globally, we're about 400 megahertz almost behind other countries right now when it comes to licensed mid-band spectrum. With respect to China in particular, we are close to 700 megahertz behind. And on the current trajectory, those gaps are expected to widen. And that's a problem because America's leadership in wireless is part and parcel of our geopolitical leadership. When we free up spectrum and we move airwaves into the commercial marketplace, capital flows here, standard-setting bodies look to the U.S. to make sure that the products are going to work for our market. So it really gives us a lot of influence globally. And the opposite is true. If we start to recede on spectrum, it only emboldens China and other sort of foreign adversaries that don't share our values or even goals for particular spectrum bands. So again, we've got to get moving on spectrum again.
One of the bands that INCOMPAS and a number of its members have been most interested in is the lower of the 12 gigahertz band, right? So that's a proceeding that's been teed up. I know the commission is looking really hard at that. Give us, how you see that playing out. I think you wanted to follow where the engineering goes. So what are you hearing on that? What's your expectations? And that doesn't require the FCC to have spectrum authorities. I think it is a really ripe for potential decision.
Yeah, no news on when the agency might move on 12 gigahertz in particular, but my guide star there continues to be the same, which I'm always open to find a win-win. If we can do more without, causing harmful interference to existing incumbents, then we should. And again, I think stepping back, I think job one of the FCC on spectrum should be to identify, large swaths of spectrum that we can open up for what we call sort of exclusive license use. But step two, you have to get too fast as well, which is when you can't, you got to look for creative ways. And maybe 12 is a way to do that. Again, if we can get to a win-win. I've identified other spectrum bands, including one technically called Uni-2C, that is effectively a Wi-Fi band today, but is largely underutilized because of some of the listen before talk technologies that apply to it. So again, job one is, in my view, particularly where we are right now, licensed mid-band spectrum. But then, yeah, let's look for creative ways to see if we can fill in and do more with existing bands.
And then give us your perspective on, the ability of satellite to really help us meet the needs of American consumers, no matter where they are, very far reaching parts of the country.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. If you look at obviously what Starlink is doing, you look at what Kuiper is planning to do, there's other systems that are up and running. I think it's going to be a phenomenal complement to our terrestrial networks. It's not that everybody's going to get on, this new generation of LEO satellites. There's not enough capacity necessarily to put everybody on there. But again, in those hardest to serve parts of the countries and areas where, a second competitor can be introduced, those technologies are performing phenomenally. And again, we've long had relatively high speed service to a standalone dish that you then can Wi-Fi off of, like Starlink, and we've also had direct to handset satellite technologies that are sort of low bandwidth, not really broadband. And we're starting to see that blend of the two, where we have these new technologies that can go straight from a satellite to your handset with something that looks like or is approaching broadband speeds. And so I think it's exciting to see what this entire new generation of LEO systems is going to do.
That is exciting. Ran into some of the folks from the FCC that are in the Space Bureau, like really working on these cutting
Yeah, I mean,
edge
they're basically astronauts
technologies.
now. We can just call them that.
I
They're like
know.
FCC astronauts.
She's like, we're not the satellite bureau, Angie. We're the space bureau. And
That's right.
I was like, oh wait, sorry. Yeah, I got that wrong.
Yeah.
I know it is. It is exciting to see these new technologies that are coming into place that can do
And there's-
things that we never really imagined. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember, I've been around long
Yeah.
enough that I remember when it was voice satellite service, right? And it was just all going to be
Yeah.
phone. And now the fact that people will be able to use their broadband no matter
Yeah.
where they are.
And there's new threats as well. I mean, I talked about, Starlink, but, China is looking to stand up its own version of this sort of global low Earth satellite system. My understanding is called StarNet because there's a lot of replicating of U.S. technology out there, and China may have other sort of satellite systems as well. But I think we have to be very cognizant of policymakers of moving fast so that Starlink, Kuiper, and others can get up and running and working, because once China stands up its version of that, which rumor is maybe it's 2028, give or take, there's some pretty interesting implications we have to think about when China can take its existing Belt and Road relationships and terrestrial infrastructure and pair that with internet service that can be provided anywhere from space, including potentially, the very sort of authoritarian filters that the CCP is known to put on those types of internet technologies. I think as a country, again, as you look at the capacity of China to provide Starlink-like services in the not too distant future, we need to really be thinking through as policymakers, what does that mean? And is there more or different actions we should take today with that in mind?
Well, you've been very forward thinking on these types of issues, like what the FCC can do with what it has available to it. So any further recommendations about what the Space Bureau and the chairwoman's office could be working on to help improve our position internationally when it comes to satellite service?
Yeah, the most important thing is one that's a challenge that the Bureau is working on. And that was really, I think, part of the motivation for the chair to stand this up, which is just to continue to move faster. I mean, obviously, we're seeing just a rapid acceleration in new satellites that are going up, market access requests. And so I just think we have to continue to move at the FCC with something approaching the pace of technology change in that sector.
Yeah, and that same opinion piece, it also referred that the family had purchased the Starlink service from SpaceX, but there was a waiting list. They had to wait a number of months. I think it was like 6 months or so in order to get the service. So we do need more options, right?
Yeah.
We love competition at INCOMPAS, and we think that's a really great thing. So whatever we can do to speed it up, and let us know how we can be helpful in your effort to, ensure that the U.S. is front in all of this, but also that we have competitive options for consumers. All right. So we have a lot of folks in this room that are working every day with those who are actually in process of building the networks and the workforce and the training issues that go along with that. This has been a big part of your agenda at the FCC. Tell us what you've been doing. Tell us what you're seeing in the marketplace and where the FCC's actions may be able to further improve workforce development and training.
Yeah, you're right. When I started out, I talked about spectrum and infrastructure as two key pieces. If there's a third leg to that stool, it's workforce. And obviously a couple of years ago, we all realized that we needed to bolster America's skilled workforce, both the tower climbers, fiber splicers that are needed to build these out. Again, that's particularly critical now. We have all of this BEAD dollars that are about to hit the ground, and the demand for crews is going to sort of go through the roof. And so there's lots of ways you can do it. I've worked a lot, individually with community colleges around the country to stand up tower climbing and other sort of technical training programs. That's a great way of doing it. We've had some success there. But obviously some companies are doing this in-house, and Department of Labor, it's apprenticeship program. So there's a lot of interesting job opportunities right now that we need to continue to keep an eye on as these sort of BEAD programs start to get going.
And the fiber connectivity too. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity there for fiber splicers, right? And those who maintain the networks. So it's going to be key to make sure that there are opportunities for training all over the country as we see more fiber being built, in addition to fixed wireless and now satellite too. So those are good paying jobs, right? Technology jobs. And so
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing that's interesting about tower climbing in particular is you can go from having no skills, and you can go through an 8 to 12 week class that teaches you the mix of like physical skills, but also technical skills to land a good paying job in the tower industry. You can start at, $55,000, $60,000, again, coming from no skills, and no pun intended, there's a lot of upward mobility in those jobs, and you can very quickly make over 6 figures. And from there, a lot of people start out as, tower hands, then they own their own small tower business. I've seen that across the country. So it's more than just a job. It's a good paying career.
thank you for that. And your leadership on this issue, I think, is important. You were one of the first commissioners that put a spotlight on this, and it's become even more critical as we have more public sector dollars going into the deployment agenda. So thank you for that. So you mentioned China already, but I wanted to come back to it. You said you really wanted to give your perspective on, there's a new bill that was just introduced in Congress, right? So the Chinese Communist Party, right? And how they can use communication systems and to hurt our national security interests. Give us your perspective on that. What's the latest going on with the latest bill on TikTok?
Yeah, so on TikTok, look, I've been very reticent to talk about TikTok, to go in front of people, to go on TV and talk about it. But this is one that a lot of people really, in a town like DC, where it feels like everyone goes to the corner all the time, they always find reasons not to get together on the same idea. We're seeing something happening right now and potentially this week that is very different from that. And it's one where we've got actually a broad coalition on the House side of Republicans and Democrats alike that have just gotten on a bill introduced within the last hour or two that would either ban TikTok or require it to genuinely divest its ties, sever its ties back to the CCP. And this is not just another messaging bill. This is a bill that committee leadership has already said will get a vote in committee this Thursday. And so again, we have this broad coalition, Republicans, Democrats, everyone from Freedom Caucus on the right to Democrats on the left, together on this bill. And it's going to go through the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where Chair Rogers has been doing a phenomenal job, both generally and on TikTok. I think a lot of people remember last year, there was sort of as hearings go, a blockbuster hearing where the TikTok CEO testified. And the way to think about this bill is this is sort of the other shoe dropping from that hearing. And I'm really, hopeful that this is the bill that will get across the finish line, because it's very clear through TikTok's own conduct that it is both beholden to the CCP and that it presents a very serious threat to U.S. national security, both from an espionage perspective. As we've seen, they've spied on the locations of specific Americans. They have misled U.S. officials repeatedly about the scope and extent of data that is accessed by personnel inside Beijing. And so it's a real threat that we need to move on now. And I'm actually, really pleased to see this bipartisan legislation, again, moving through House Commerce, but having been worked up through the China Select Committee, which is chaired by Republican Mike Gallagher. But the bill is also authored by Democrat Krishnamurthy from Illinois. And this is a really, really important development, because this is the bill that will definitively resolve the TikTok threat.
So a vote, you said, this Thursday in the committee,
Yep.
And then expectations it could move quickly through the House?
I would hope so. Again, when you have this high number of Republicans and Democrats on board together on a big issue, it's very rare in Washington. So I do hope that it moves quickly after the committee vote. And frankly, this is an issue where a lot of the strong leaders on this have been Democrats. You look at the chair of the Senate Intel Committee, Mark Warner. He's said repeatedly that, of all the confidential SCIF level briefings that he gets, it's TikTok that scares the dickens out of him. And it's a very real threat. And it's not simply about, TikTok is an entity that ultimately has some ties back to China. There are what we call plus factors with TikTok that we know from its own conduct that there's a very serious problem. That's why you're seeing everyone from FBI, ODNI, CIA director, everyone in sort of the national security apparatus has sort of raised the alarm on it. And so this is the bill that's an appropriate response to all of that.
And then in terms of the FCC's jurisdiction over communications networks and the national security issues there, give us your perspective on how do we ensure that our communications networks stay safe and secure?
Yeah, with respect to TikTok in particular, obviously the main focus of action is going to be Congress or other agencies other than the FCC that have some extensive authorities as well. But the way I've always approached it at the FCC is when you look at national security threats generally, we do have some expertise when it comes to data flows and entities that are beholden to the CCP. So we took action in the US, we call the device layer on Huawei and ZTE. That was action that the FCC took. We then moved up and took action we call the carrier level. So we took action at the FCC on China Mobile, China Unicom, other carriers. And now we need to get a win at the application level because secure devices, secure carrier networks don't mean enough unless we also go to the applications that are running. And TikTok is an application that has gone through a very comprehensive national security process and has identified it like Huawei, like ZTE, like China Mobile as presenting a threat that can't otherwise be mitigated. So that's why we need to sort of take an action at the government level on TikTok itself. And frankly, we obviously aren't on the leading edge of this as a country. India banned TikTok back in 2020. I was just there a week ago meeting with some of the government officials engaged in that. So it's, if anything, is an overdue, but this is an appropriate time to take action.
Are there other kinds of applications that have you concerned in addition to TikTok?
Yeah, I think there's others. I mean, look, once you take action on TikTok, because it has such a clear track record, you then can look around and say, okay, what's like TikTok? It's sort of similar to what we did with Huawei. First we did Huawei, then we did ZTE, then we did China Mobile, then we did China Telecom. So it gives you a place to sort of understand the type of threat and take action. So yes, we need to look more broadly, sort of comprehensively at all threats from entities that not just tied to China, but tied to the CCP. And that broader conversation continue to take place. But in the near term, get a win on TikTok, and then we can go after ones that look sufficiently similar from a security risk perspective.
One of the things that INCOMPAS has been working on with our member companies is the International 214 proceeding, right? Where the commission's looking at potentially making some significant changes to ownership review, right? And different timeframes in which licensees may need to come back to the FCC to do the ownership review beyond just merger agreements, where often the FCC is looking at ownership structure. Any thoughts about, I know they just did a big data collection, so I know they're probably sifting through a lot of data, but any thoughts about how the commission might be able to use that rulemaking process to do further reviews of international 214 authorizations?
Yeah, I'm interested in seeing what we learn from that proceeding. I mean, look, the relationships that are at issue when you talk about an undersea cable are getting, in my view, increasingly complicated. Who's leasing it, who's owning it, who's using it to transmit data. And I do think it's appropriate for the FCC to do a refresh to make sure that we're getting the right information about how these undersea cables are being used. Obviously, you can always do something in a way that ends up being too regulatory, but at a minimum, we need to take a look at this. And I'm open-minded about a refresh there to make sure that, again, as the relationships here get more and more complex, we're not missing a security threat.
That's really helpful. And thank you for coming again. It's been really great to sit down again and go through these issues of great importance to the industry and to your office. And you have such great staff, always open and available to answer questions. I hope you've enjoyed your time with us.
I enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks so much. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.